Listen up. You ever been the one they chose, then watch them throw you away like last week's garbage when someone better walked through the door? That's where this story starts. A woman who survived the frontier, who earned her place through blood and steel, standing in front of the most powerful man in 7 kingdoms, while he tells the entire empire she was never good enough. But here's what they didn't know. Rejection doesn't break everyone. Sometimes it wakes something worse. So buckle up, because this story doesn't end where you think it does. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. Let's see where my tribe is watching from. The Hall of Sovereigns smelled like expensive perfume and older money. Seris Virell stood in the center of it all, her dress carrying dust from 3 weeks of frontier patrol, while every other woman in the chamber glittered like walking jewelry stores. The marble floor beneath her boots had probably cost more than her entire village made in a year. Above her, chandeliers dripped frozen crystal that caught torchlight and threw it back in 1,000 directions, turning the whole damn place into something between a palace and a fever dream. She'd been standing there for 20 minutes, waiting. That should have been the first warning. Kings don't make people wait unless they're sending a message. The nobles lined both sides of the hall like they'd been placed there by some cosmic set designer. Silver cloaks, gold trim, faces so carefully composed they looked like masks. Generals in the back row wore their scars like they were medals earned in hell. Everyone knew what this ceremony meant. The imperial bond, the joining of bloodlines. The moment when King Vaelor would formalize the alliance that had been negotiated through 6 months of frontier diplomacy and 3 dead ambassadors. Seris had survived assassins to get here. She'd crossed the scorched territories with 14 soldiers. 7 made it back. And for what? To stand in a room full of people who looked at her like she was something they'd tracked in on their boots. The massive doors at the far end of the hall swung open with the kind of theatrical timing that made Seris want to laugh. Or punch something, maybe both. King Vaelor entered like conquest itself had learned to walk. 6'3", black ceremonial armor that looked like it had been forged from midnight and bad decisions. His face was the kind of handsome that probably got people killed. Sharp angles, dark eyes that missed nothing, and a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled by someone who understood geometry and cruelty in equal measure. He walked alone. That was power. Not needing an entourage, not requiring announcement. The entire hall dropped to their knees in synchronized reverence that would have been impressive if it wasn't so disturbing. Seris remained standing. She saw his eyes flick to her. Register the defiance, calculate its meaning, then dismiss it entirely. He stopped 10 feet away from her, close enough to speak, far enough to maintain distance. Everything about his posture screamed control. When he spoke, his voice carried through the hall like rolling thunder. Not loud, just undeniable. Seris Virell of the border territories, you were summoned here under diplomatic seal. The Imperial Council and I have reviewed the terms of alliance your commanders proposed. Something in his tone made her spine straighten. This wasn't how royal bonds got announced. This was how executions started. The 7 Crowns' dominion does not forge chains with weakness, Vaelor continued, his words falling like hammers on stone. Our bloodline has remained pure for 12 generations. Every alliance we make strengthens the throne, or it serves no purpose. A noble near the front row actually smiled. They knew. Everyone in this goddamn hall knew what was coming except her. You come from nothing, Vaelor said, his voice perfectly level, perfectly calm, perfectly devastating. Your family name carries no weight. Your territories produce dust and desperation. Your blood offers nothing to the imperial line except dilution. The words hit like physical blows. You were never made for my throne. Silence swallowed the room. Then someone laughed. It started small. A noble in the 3rd row whose face Seris would remember until the day she died. Then others joined, polite, restrained. The kind of laughter that happens when cruelty gets permission to dress up as entertainment. Seris felt heat crawl up her spine. Not embarrassment, something colder, angrier. She'd watched 14 soldiers she'd trained die protecting supply routes that kept this empire fed. She'd put down 3 frontier rebellions that would have cut off trade to half these bastards' estates. She'd earned every scar on her body keeping border towns from turning into mass graves. And this man was dismissing her like she was a clerical error. Vaelor turned to walk away. That was the moment something in Seris broke. Or maybe it didn't break. Maybe it finally woke up. No. Her voice cut through the laughter like broken glass through silk. Vaelor stopped, turned. His expression carried something between curiosity and annoyance. No? He repeated, the word hanging in the air like a challenge waiting to be answered. I reject you too, Seris said, her voice steady despite her heart trying to kick its way out of her chest. Whatever diplomatic arrangement brought me here, whatever political game you're playing, I want no part of it. The hall went absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Vaelor's eyes narrowed. You don't understand what you're... I understand perfectly, Seris interrupted, and that got gasps from half the room because apparently interrupting a king was somewhere between sacrilege and suicide. You want me to stand here while you humiliate me in front of your entire court? Smile while you demonstrate how disposable I am. Accept whatever scraps of mercy you decide to throw at the dirty border girl who had the audacity to think she belonged here. She took a step toward him. I've survived things you've never even heard of. I've led soldiers through hell and brought most of them back. I've earned my place in this world without your permission or your throne. Another step. So keep your crown, keep your pure bloodline, keep your empire built on looking down at everyone who doesn't wear enough gold. She was close enough now to see his jaw tighten. I reject you. I reject this ceremony, and I reject every assumption you made about who I am and what I'm worth. For the first time since entering the hall, Seris saw something flicker across Vaelor's face that wasn't complete control. Surprise. Maybe respect. Then it vanished behind cold precision. Remove her from the palace, he said to the guards near the doors. The ceremony is concluded. Seris turned and walked out on her own power before anyone could touch her. The hall exploded into whispered chaos behind her. She made it 3 corridors before her hands started shaking. 5 corridors before the rage turned into something that felt dangerously close to tears. 7 corridors before she found an empty corner and pressed her back against cold stone and reminded herself how to breathe. Pride was expensive. She'd just bought a lifetime supply. The palace expelled her like an infection. No formal escort. No diplomatic courtesy. Just 4 guards who walked her to the gates and watched her leave like she might try to steal something on the way out. Seris walked through the capital streets with her jaw clenched and her eyes forward. People stared. Word traveled fast in imperial cities. By sunset, everyone would know. The border woman who got rejected by the king and had the nerve to reject him back. She'd be a joke, a cautionary tale. The fool who thought she could stand in halls built for gods. 3 days later, she stopped caring what they thought. Because 3 days later, someone tried to kill her. Not robbery. Not random violence. Professional assassination. She was staying in a run-down frontier inn at the edge of the capital, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the company was cheaper. 2 men came through her window at midnight with blades designed for silence and efficiency. Seris killed the first one with the chair beside her bed. The second one managed to cut her shoulder before she got her boot knife into his throat. Both wore guild marks, expensive guild marks, the kind you needed palace connections to afford. She burned their bodies in the inn's furnace before anyone could ask questions, then disappeared into the city's underground before dawn. That's when she understood. This wasn't just humiliation, it was extermination. Someone wanted her erased from memory, from existence, from the possibility that she might someday become inconvenient. Kings don't just reject people they consider harmless. They make them disappear when they consider them threats. The frontier teaches you things palace-raised nobles never learn. How to read tracks in dust. How to survive on half rations and pure spite. How to find people who don't want to be found. Seris spent 2 weeks moving through the capital's forgotten places. The district's tourists didn't visit. The neighborhoods where imperial gold didn't reach. She traded information, called in favors from soldiers who'd served with her, followed leads that usually went nowhere. Until one went somewhere. An old woman in the textile district, half blind and bitter, told her about the archive of forbidden records. A place that technically didn't exist. Where the empire buried history it didn't want examined. Things that make the crown look bad, the old woman said, her clouded eyes fixed on something in the middle distance. Wars that weren't as clean as the histories claim, bloodlines that got erased, massacres dressed up as diplomatic resolutions. Why are you telling me this? Seris asked. Because you got that look, the woman said. Same look my daughter had before the Imperial Guard disappeared her for asking wrong questions. That look that says you've already decided dying is preferable to backing down. She gave Seris directions to a monastery, abandoned, 3 weeks outside the capital, built on ruins older than the Empire itself. If you find what you're looking for, the old woman added, you'll wish you hadn't. Seris left that night. The scorched territories lived up to their name. 43 days of brutal heat, limited water, and landscape that looked like the gods had gotten angry and forgot to stop. The monastery sat at the edge of nothing, black stone buildings half swallowed by sand dunes that shifted with every wind. She found Vaelor Thorn in what used to be the library. He was old, 70 at least, but his eyes were sharp as broken glass and his hands didn't shake when he pointed a crossbow at her chest. You're lost, he said. Not a question. I'm looking for truth, Seris replied. Those are the same thing out here. He didn't lower the crossbow. Seris didn't move. They stood like that for 30 seconds while dust motes drifted through broken windows. Then Vaelor smiled. What's your name? Seris Virell. Something changed in his expression. Recognition. Maybe fear. Virell, he repeated slowly, like tasting wine. Your mother. Where was she born? Dead before I knew her. Records say somewhere in the eastern provinces. Records lie, Vaelor said, finally lowering the crossbow. Records always lie when truth becomes expensive. He turned and walked deeper into the ruins. After a moment, Seris followed. The archive beneath the monastery had been built by people who understood secrecy. Stone stairs descending into darkness. Chambers that felt older than memory. Shelves carved directly into rock walls, holding texts wrapped in preservation cloth that looked like it predated the Empire itself. Vaelor lit candles that had been waiting decades for this moment. House Solaryn, he said, pulling a leather-bound volume from a shelf. You've heard of them? No, exactly. He opened the book, pages crackling like dry bones. They were erased, not just killed, erased. Every monument destroyed, every record burned, every person who spoke their name too loudly disappeared. Why? Because they were powerful, because they rivaled the throne, because 12 generations ago they nearly won a civil war that would have ended the Draven dynasty before it consolidated power. He showed her genealogies, family trees that branched and twisted through centuries, names that had been physically cut out of official records. Then he showed her the last page, a single entry, barely legible, written in ink that had faded to almost nothing. Seris traced the line with her finger, from House Solaryn's main branch, through scattered survivors who fled into frontier territories, through generations of people who forgot their own history to survive. Her name was at the bottom. You're not border-born trash, Vaelor said quietly. You're the last heir to the most dangerous bloodline in Imperial history. The words felt like falling. This is impossible. Impossible is what emperors call anything that threatens their narrative, Vaelor said. Your mother knew. That's why she died. Your grandmother knew. That's why records of your birth were altered. Your entire family spent 100 years disappearing into nothing so the Empire wouldn't finish what it started. Seris stared at the page, at her name, at the blood connection that made her something she'd never imagined. Why tell me this? She asked. What am I supposed to do with it? Vaelor's expression was grim. Survive. Because the moment Vaelor rejected you publicly, the moment you rejected him back, you became visible. And visibility is death for Solaryn blood. Someone already tried to kill me. They'll try again. And again. Until you're buried so deep, history forgets you existed. He paused. Or until you stop running and remind the Empire why your house was worth exterminating in the first place. Seris felt something shift in her chest, something that had been sleeping for generations. What if I don't want to be some dead house's legacy? Then die quietly, Vaelor said, because that's the only other option they're offering. She stayed at the monastery for 9 days. Vaelor taught her things the Empire had spent centuries burying, the real reason for wars that official histories called just, the bloodlines that got erased when they became inconvenient, the pattern of power that repeated itself like a heartbeat, Eliminate competition, rewrite history, call it civilization. On the 10th day, Imperial soldiers arrived. Seris watched from his highest tower as they surrounded the monastery. 50 men, professional, carrying weapons too expensive for routine patrol. They found you, Vaelor said beside her. How? Someone always talks. Someone always sells information. That's how empires maintain control. Fear and gold in equal measure. We could run. Where? They've surrounded every approach. This isn't random. This is execution. Seris felt her hand drift to the blade at her hip. Border steel. Nothing fancy, but sharp enough for purpose. I'm tired of running, she said. Then you'll die here. Maybe. She turned to face him. Or maybe I remind them why they spent so much energy making sure my family disappeared. Vaelor smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. There's power in your blood, he said quietly. Old power. The kind that doesn't come from training or discipline. It comes from lineage, from ancestry that runs deeper than memory. I don't know how to access it. You will, when survival becomes the only mathematics that matters. He handed her a small vial, dark liquid that seemed to shift in the light. Solaryn blood wakes in fire. This will help, or kill you. Depends on whether the bloodline recognizes you as worthy. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. The soldiers reached the monastery doors. Seris descended the stairs alone. Vaelor stayed behind, said something about old men and dignity. She met them in the courtyard where sand met stone. The commander was young, mid-30s, the kind of confident that comes from never losing. He smiled when he saw her. Seris Virell, you're wanted back in the capital. For what? Questions. Concerning your family history and certain treasonous affiliations. Treasonous? I'm border military. I've served for 6 years. You served until you became a problem. Now you're something else. 10 soldiers stepped forward, hands on weapons. Seris understood the mathematics. She couldn't win this fight. Not with skill, not with strategy. But Vaelor's words echoed in her mind. Solaryn blood wakes in fire. She uncorked the vial and drank before doubt could stop her. The liquid burned like swallowing lightning. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then her blood caught fire. Not metaphorically, actually ignited. Pain ripped through every nerve. Her vision went white. She felt her body collapsing, but something else rising. Something old. Something that had been waiting generations for permission to exist. When Seris opened her eyes, the world looked different, sharper, clearer, like someone had removed a filter she didn't know existed. And her hands were burning, not burning away, burning with purpose. Flame that didn't consume, just existed. Gold and red and something darker underneath. The soldiers stepped back. The commander's confidence cracked. What are you? He whispered. Seris didn't answer. She raised one hand and fire answered like it had been waiting its entire existence for this moment. The fight was over in 3 minutes. Not because she was skilled, because the power coursing through her veins didn't care about training or technique. It cared about survival, about legacy, about bloodlines that refused to stay buried. When it was done, the courtyard was ash and bodies, and Seris standing in the center, breathing hard, hands still burning with ancestral flame. Vaelor appeared in the doorway. So, he said quietly, the blood recognized you. What did I just do? Announced yourself to an empire that thought you were extinct. Seris looked at her hands, at the fire that was starting to fade but left marks like tattoos beneath her skin. They'll send more soldiers. They'll send everything, because you just became the one thing emperors fear more than rebellion. What's that? Living proof that their power isn't absolute. News traveled faster than Seris could run. By the time she reached the capital's outskirts, everyone knew. The border woman who burned 50 Imperial soldiers. The girl who claimed Solaryn blood. The threat that turned from rumor into nightmare. She didn't hide. Didn't disguise herself. Walked straight through the main gates like she owned the streets. People scattered. Merchants closed shops. Mothers pulled children inside. Even the city guard kept their distance. She walked directly to the Imperial citadel and demanded an audience with the king. They arrested her instead. Threw her in cells beneath the palace. Black stone and iron bars and guards who looked at her like she might explode at any moment. She stayed there for 3 days. No trial, no charges. Just isolation and the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. On the 4th day, Chancellor Velmora arrived. She was everything Seris wasn't. Elegant, poised, dressed in silk that probably cost more than a year's military salary. Her face was beautiful in a calculated way, like every feature had been strategically arranged for maximum impact. Seris Virell, she said, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that only comes from extensive practice. Or should I say, House Solaryn? I didn't choose that name. But you're not rejecting it, Velmora smiled. That's politically significant. What do you want? To offer you survival. The Imperial Council has reviewed your situation. Your bloodline presents complications, but complications can be managed. Managed how? Renounce your claim, publicly. Accept ceremonial sealing, a procedure that would prevent any future heirs from inheriting Solaryn traits. In exchange, you receive wealth, protection, a comfortable life away from politics. Castration dressed as mercy, Seris said. How generous. Velmora's smile didn't waver. The alternative is execution. Messy, public, a warning to anyone else who might consider resurrecting dead bloodlines. Or you could just let me leave. You killed 50 soldiers. You demonstrated powers the Empire spent centuries suppressing. You're not a person anymore. You're a symbol, and symbols either serve the throne or get erased. Seris leaned forward, close enough to see the calculation in Velmora's eyes. Then I guess I'll be a symbol that doesn't kneel. Velmora's expression hardened. You're choosing death. I'm choosing myself. The Chancellor stood, smoothing her dress with practiced grace. The Council will petition for crown trial, ancient law, the kind of spectacle people remember for generations. You'll face King Vaelor in the Crimson Arena, before the entire Dominion, and you'll lose. Maybe. Not maybe. Certainty. This was decided before you walked into the palace. The trial is theater. The verdict is already written. She paused at the cell door. I almost admire you, that stubborn refusal to accept reality. But reality doesn't care about courage. It just is. Then I guess we'll see whose reality survives, Seris said. Velmora left without another word. Seris sat in darkness and felt Solaryn blood burning beneath her skin like a promise, or a threat. 2 days later, they announced the crown trial to the Empire. The Crimson Arena filled beyond capacity. Every noble house sent representatives. Every military division stationed nearby got invited. Common citizens packed the upper tiers until guards had to turn people away. This was entertainment and warning combined. The Empire showing what happened when you challenge sovereign authority. Seris was escorted to the arena floor in chains, not because they thought she'd run, because optics mattered. The condemned had to look condemned. She wore the same leather armor she'd been arrested in. Nothing ceremonial, nothing imperial, just frontier gear that had seen too many battles. Across the sand, King Vaelor Draven entered like walking thunder. Black ceremonial armor, blade that looked like it had been forged from shadows and promises. Every movement calculated for maximum impact. The crowd roared. Seris looked up at thousands of faces, some excited, some hungry for blood, some just there because entertainment was entertainment regardless of the cost. The herald's voice boomed across the arena. By ancient sovereign law, conflict between disputed bloodlines would be resolved through crown trial, combat until surrender or death, judgment witnessed by the Empire, victory determining truth, clean, simple, brutal. Seris's chains were removed. She drew her blade, border steel that looked crude next to Vaelor's weapon, but had kept her alive through 6 years of frontier hell. The herald raised his hand, then dropped it, and the trial began. Vaelor moved like water that had learned violence, fast, precise, every attack flowing into the next with the kind of grace that only comes from lifetime training. Seris blocked, countered, survived. She wasn't as skilled, wasn't as polished, but she'd learned fighting where mistakes meant death, not bruises, where style meant less than staying alive. Their blades met with sounds like breaking thunder. The crowd went wild. Vaelor drove her back across the sand. His technique was flawless, every strike designed to probe defenses, test reactions, create openings. You fight well, he said, his voice barely audible over clashing steel. for someone self-taught. Survival is an excellent teacher, Seris replied, dodging a thrust that would have opened her throat. It teaches wrong lessons, makes you reactive instead of strategic. Still alive, though. She saw his lips twitch, almost a smile. Then he attacked harder. The fight consumed them both. Time dissolved into blade work and footwork and the mathematics of violence. Seris felt her arms burning, felt exhaustion creeping in at the edges. Vaelor barely seemed winded. She needed an advantage, something he wouldn't expect. That's when she saw them, hidden in the crowd. Archers positioned in the upper tiers, crossbows trained not on her, on both of them. Insurance. If Vaelor somehow lost, someone else would finish the job. She understood then. Velmora hadn't lied. The verdict was already written. This trial was just theater, justification for murder dressed as justice. They were never going to let her leave this arena alive. Seris felt something break inside her, not fear, not despair, fury, pure, cold, absolute. She'd survived the frontier, survived assassination, survived discovery of a heritage that made her a target. All of it to stand here and die in political theater designed to protect men who'd never bled for anything real. No, not today. Not like this. Seris stepped back, lowering her blade. Vaelor hesitated, confusion crossing his face. What are you doing? Something I should have done 3 weeks ago, Seris said. She closed her eyes, found the fire in her blood, and let it wake up. The arena exploded in light and heat and flame that roared like destiny finally getting permission to exist. When the smoke cleared, Seris stood transformed. Fire wreathed her body like living armor. Her eyes burned gold. Patterns that looked like ancient scripture coursed across her skin, glowing with power that predated the empire itself. The crowd fell silent. Absolute. Complete. Terrified silence. Because the empire had spent 12 generations burying monsters. Instead, it had buried something worse. Heirs. Vaelor stared at her, his blade forgotten. For the first time in his life, the king looked afraid. The word hung in the air between them like something physical. Something that could be touched, measured, weighed against everything Vaelor Draven had built his entire existence around. Kings don't feel fear. That's what his father had beaten into him. Literally. Every time young Vaelor showed hesitation, showed mercy, showed anything resembling human weakness, his father's fists reminded him what sovereignty actually meant. You are the throne. The throne does not bend, does not break, does not feel. Except right now, standing in the Crimson Arena with 50,000 witnesses, and a woman wrapped in ancestral fire that shouldn't exist, Vaelor felt something crack in the foundation of everything he thought he understood about power. Because Seris wasn't attacking, she was just standing there, burning, waiting, and somehow that was more terrifying than any blade. The fire around her moved like it was alive, not wild, controlled, spiraling in patterns that looked almost deliberate, like language written in flame. Her eyes had gone from brown to molten gold, and when she looked at him, Vaelor felt something in his chest tighten. Recognition. Not of her, of what she represented, everything the Empire had tried to bury. Everything his bloodline had spent 12 generations suppressing, standing in front of him, refusing to die quietly. You can measure a man's character by what he does when his assumptions shatter. Some men double down, some men retreat. Some men finally see clearly for the first time in their lives. Vaelor did all three simultaneously. Impossible, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying across the suddenly silent arena. Solaryn blood was exterminated. Every record confirms it. Records lie when truth becomes expensive, Seris replied, her voice different now, deeper, like the fire had changed more than just her appearance. Your family made sure of that. My family protected the Empire from civil war. Your family committed genocide and called it peacekeeping. The words hit like accusations at trial, public, undeniable, witnessed by thousands. Vaelor felt the weight of every eye in the arena, felt the narrative slipping from his control. This was supposed to be simple. Execution dressed as justice, the crown demonstrating authority over anything that threatened stability. Instead, it was becoming something else, truth on trial. And truth was notoriously difficult to kill once it started burning. You don't understand what you're doing, Vaelor said, adjusting his grip on his blade. The power you're wielding, it's dangerous, unstable. It destroyed entire cities when Solaryn bloodlines went to war against each other. Then maybe your ancestors should have tried negotiation instead of extermination. They tried. Solaryn pride refused compromise. Funny how conquerors always blame the conquered for their own extinction. Seris took a step forward. The sand beneath her feet turned to glass from the heat. Vaelor held his ground, but something in his body wanted to retreat, wanted to run. Every combat instinct he'd honed over 20 years of training screamed that this fight had shifted beyond steel and strategy into something older and far more dangerous. "Stand down," he said, injecting command into his voice. "This trial is over. You've proven your bloodline. The council will acknowledge—" "The council will acknowledge nothing," Seris interrupted. "I saw the archers in the crowd. I saw Vaelmora's insurance policy. This trial was never about justice. It was about making my death look legitimate." She gestured to the upper tiers. Every head in the arena turned to follow her motion. And there they were. 12 crossbowmen positioned in strategic locations. Weapons still trained on the arena floor. No attempt to hide anymore because hiding had become pointless. The crowd erupted. Not cheering. Something worse. Confusion. Anger. The sound of collective realization that they'd been complicit in theater designed to justify murder. Vaelor's jaw tightened. He looked up at the royal box where Chancellor Vaelmora sat, her expression carefully neutral. Too neutral. The kind of blank that only comes from extensive practice at concealing truth. "Your orders?" he asked, his voice carrying up to her. Vaelmora stood, adjusted her dress, smiled like someone who'd prepared for this exact moment. "The girl has demonstrated dangerous instability," she announced, her voice projecting across the arena with practiced ease. "For the safety of the Empire, she must be contained. Archers, execute the standing order." 12 crossbows shifted aim. Not at Seris, at Vaelor. The king's eyes widened. Understanding crashed through him like ice water. The insurance policy wasn't just about Seris, it was about control. About making sure that regardless of trial outcome, Vaelmora's faction maintained authority. If Seris won, she died to archers. If Vaelor won but showed any mercy, any hesitation, any sign of being compromised by Solaryn influence, he died too. And Vaelmora would step into the power vacuum with clean hands and unanimous council support. Politics is just murder-wearing diplomatic language. Vaelor had lived by that principle his entire reign, had used it to justify every harsh decision, every brutal necessity, every time mercy got sacrificed on the altar of stability. Now that same principle was aimed at his chest. "You planned this," he said, his voice carrying disbelief and something that might have been respect. "The entire trial. My rejection of her. Everything." "I planned for every outcome," Vaelmora replied calmly. "That's what competent leadership looks like. You were becoming sentimental, distracted. The Empire doesn't survive sentiment." "I built this empire." "You inherited it. There's a difference." The words landed like physical blows. Seris watched the exchange with something between fascination and rage. She'd spent weeks thinking Vaelor was the problem, the source of her persecution, the arrogant king who'd humiliated her because he could. But standing here watching him realize he'd been a puppet in someone else's game, she understood something more complicated. Power doesn't flow from crowns. It flows through fear. And fear had been ruling through Vaelor for years without him realizing it. "So what now?" Vaelor asked, his blade still raised, but his attention split between Seris and the crossbowmen. "You kill us both? Blame it on Solaryn fire? Become regent until the council selects a more manageable king?" "Something like that," Vaelmora said. "The details are flexible. But yes, essentially, you've become inconvenient. Both of you." She gestured to the archers. "Fire on my mark." Time compressed into decision. Vaelor could try to survive, could use Seris as a shield, could fight his way out and deal with political fallout later, could prove he was everything his father trained him to be. Cold, strategic, willing to sacrifice anything for survival. Or he could do something he'd never done in his entire reign, trust someone who wasn't supposed to matter. He looked at Seris, at the fire still wreathing her body, at the woman he'd dismissed as unworthy standing in front of him, burning with proof that his entire understanding of legitimacy was built on lies. "Can you stop them?" he asked quietly. Seris blinked. What? The archers. Can your fire reach them before their bolts reach us? I don't know. I've had this power for less than a week. That's not encouraging. You want encouraging? Find a different woman. Despite everything, Vaelor almost laughed. There's something clarifying about standing at the edge of execution. All the political calculation, all the careful image management, all the machinery of sovereignty, it all falls away, and you're left with one simple question. Who do you want to be in the last moment before everything changes? Work with me, Vaelor said, lowering his blade slightly. Just for the next 3 minutes. We survive this. We can go back to hating each other. You think I hate you? You rejected me in front of my entire court. You rejected me first. Fair point. Seris looked at him, really looked, not at the crown or the armor or the legend, at the man underneath who was scared and trying not to show it, and making the kind of desperate alliance that political training said was suicide. 3 minutes, she agreed. Mark, Vaelor called from above. 12 fingers tightened on triggers. Seris raised both hands and fire exploded outward in a wave that turned air to superheated wind. Not wild, directed. A wall of flame that intercepted crossbow bolts mid-flight and reduced them to ash before steel could reach flesh. The crowd screamed, nobles scattered, commoners stampeded toward exits. Guards drew weapons but had no idea who to point them at. Chaos is the natural state of any system where control becomes illusion. Vaelor's expression finally cracked. Just for a second. Long enough for Seris to see fear underneath the diplomatic mask. Contain them, the Chancellor shouted to the guards. Both of them, alive if possible, dead if necessary. 50 Imperial guards moved to surround the arena floor. Vaelor looked at Seris. Please tell me you have more than fire tricks. I have a lot of anger and no plan. Also not encouraging. Stop asking for encouragement. The guards closed in. Professional. Disciplined. The kind of soldiers who followed orders even when orders stopped making sense. Vaelor stepped forward, not attacking, just placing himself between Seris and the approaching weapons. Stand down, he commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. That's a direct order from your king. The guards hesitated. Loyalty is complicated when it gets caught between competing authorities. The crown said stop. The chancellor said advance. Both commanded obedience. The guard captain looked between Vaelor and Vaelor, calculating, measuring, choosing. The chancellor's authority supersedes a compromised sovereign, he said finally. Compromised? Vaelor's voice dropped to something dangerous. I've led you through 6 campaigns, rebuilt the military after the Eastern rebellions, turned this empire from vulnerable to untouchable. And now you're defending Solaryn blood, the captain replied. That's treason by definition. Treason is what people call truth when it threatens their version of history. The words came out harder than Vaelor intended, sharper, like something that had been building pressure for years finally finding release. His entire reign had been about control, maintaining stability, preserving the empire his father built through blood and brutality. But standing here, watching his own soldiers prepare to execute him for showing mercy, Vaelor finally understood what his father had never taught him. Control built on fear isn't control. It's a prison where everyone's locked inside, including the warden. Last warning, the captain said, raising his blade. Seris moved before Vaelor could respond, not attacking, positioning, placing herself beside him instead of behind him, 2 targets instead of one shielded by the other. You're supposed to let me protect you, Vaelor said. I don't do well with supposed to, Seris replied. The guards advanced. What happened next wasn't a fight, it was a demonstration. Seris didn't just use fire. She wielded it like an extension of her body, like muscle memory inherited from ancestors who'd spent lifetimes mastering power that predated steel. Flames formed barriers, created walls, disarmed guards without killing them. She wasn't trying to slaughter. She was trying to survive without becoming the monster the Empire claimed she was. And beside her, Vaelor fought with the kind of precision that made him legendary. Every movement economical, every strike designed to disable rather than destroy. They moved together like they'd trained for this, like some part of their bodies understood coordination that their minds hadn't agreed to yet. The psychology of partnership is fascinating. 2 people who should be enemies forced into alliance by circumstances neither chose, discovering that survival creates connections that politics can't explain. The guard captain went down with Vaelor's blade at his throat and fire surrounding them both. "Yield," Vaelor said quietly. The captain looked up at him. At the king he'd served for 15 years. At the legend who was supposed to be untouchable and instead was offering mercy while standing beside the woman he was supposed to execute. "I yield," he said. The remaining guards lowered their weapons. Not from fear, from confusion, from the cognitive dissonance of watching their perfectly ordered world reveal cracks in its foundation. Vaelmora stood in the royal box, her expression finally showing emotion. Fury, pure, controlled, absolutely lethal. "This isn't over," she said, her voice carrying across the arena despite the chaos. "You think one dramatic stand changes anything? I have the council, I have the military command, I have influence in every noble house and trade guild in the empire." "You have fear," Seris called back. "That's all you've ever had, fear dressed up as authority." "Fear is authority. Everything else is naive philosophy." "Then let's test that philosophy." Seris raised her hand and fire spiraled upward, not attacking, just existing. A column of flame that rose toward the darkening sky like a beacon visible for miles. Every eye in the capital would see it, every person who'd ever questioned imperial narratives, every frontier family who'd lost someone to consolidation wars, every bloodline that had been erased and told they never existed. They would all see proof that the Empire's version of history was incomplete. And incomplete histories are how revolutions start. Vaelmora understood immediately. "You stupid girl," she hissed. "You just declared war on the entire Dominion." "No," Seris said. "I just declared myself visible. War is what you'll start trying to make me disappear again." She let the fire fade. Turned to Vaelor. "Your move, King. You can execute me yourself. Restore order. Go back to the comfortable lie that power is clean and legitimacy is inherited." She paused. "Or you can admit that maybe, just maybe, the Empire's version of truth has some serious gaps." Vaelor looked at her. At the guards watching them both. At Vaelmora radiating barely contained rage from the royal box. At the choice that would define everything that came after. Leadership isn't about making easy decisions. It's about making irreversible ones when reversible stopped being an option. "Chancellor Vaelmora," Vaelor said, his voice formal and cold. "You are hereby removed from office pending investigation into conspiracy to commit regicide and falsification of imperial records." The arena went silent. You could measure the shock in the quality of that silence. Deep, absolute. The kind that happens when reality shifts beneath everyone's feet simultaneously. Vaelmora laughed. Not hysterically, genuinely amused. "You think you can remove me? I've been engineering imperial policy since before you could hold a blade. Every trade agreement, every military deployment, every noble house alliance, I built that infrastructure. You're just the face people worship." "Then I guess we'll see if the Empire can survive without its favorite puppet master," Vaelor replied. "It can't. And when it collapses, when provinces revolt and trade routes burn and everything your father built turns to ash, remember that you chose sentiment over stability." She turned to leave. "Oh, and Vaelor, I'll be back. With evidence. With allies. With every piece of leverage I've accumulated over 20 years of actual governance. And when I return, you'll understand why mercy is a luxury emperors can't afford." Vaelmora swept out of the royal box with the kind of dramatic exit that would have been impressive if it wasn't so terrifying. Because she wasn't wrong. She did have influence, did have connections, did have decades of carefully constructed power networks that didn't rely on crowns or ceremonies. Vaelor had just made himself an enemy of the most dangerous woman in the Empire. And he'd done it to protect someone he'd publicly rejected 3 weeks ago. "So," Seris said quietly, "that was probably stupid." "Catastrophically stupid," Vaelor agreed. "Any regrets?" He looked at her, at the woman wrapped in fading fire and frontier leather who'd just turned his entire understanding of legitimacy inside out. "Ask me in a week when the assassination attempts start." "They already started, remember? Someone sent guild assassins after me 2 days after you rejected me." "Fair point." Vaelor sheathed his blade, looked around the arena at the thousands of witnesses who'd just watched their perfectly ordered empire reveal fault lines in its foundation. "We need to leave," he said. "Now, before Velmora rallies the council or calls in military favors." "Where are we going?" "Honestly, I have no idea. I just committed political suicide and crown treason. Geography seems less important than immediate survival." Seris almost smiled. "You know what the frontier teaches you? Survival first, strategy later." "That's terrible advice. And yet I'm still alive." They moved toward the arena exit. Guards parted to let them through, some from respect, some from confusion, some from the universal instinct to get out of the way when history is happening and you're not sure which side you're supposed to be on. The crowd remained silent, watching, processing. When people witness something that contradicts everything they've been taught to believe, there's a lag. A moment where the brain tries to reconcile contradiction with certainty. That lag is where change happens, where revolutions begin, where empires either adapt or start their slow collapse into irrelevance. Vaelor and Seris walked through the arena corridors, empty now. Everyone had scattered when the fighting started. "You realize we just became the Empire's most wanted," Seris said. "You were already most wanted. I just joined your club. It's not a fun club." "I'm starting to understand that." They reached an exit that led to the palace's underground passages, service corridors used by servants and supply chains, not glamorous but functional. Vaelor hesitated at the threshold. "What?" Seris asked. "I'm trying to remember the last time I used the servant passages." "Never?" "Probably." "Must be nice being king." "It was," Vaelor said. "Past tense. Pretty sure I just abdicated effective authority." "You could go back. Tell them I coerced you. That Solaryn fire messed with your mind." "I could." He didn't move. Seris studied his face, looking for doubt, regret, the calculation that said betrayal was just strategy wearing a temporary mask, but all she saw was exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying weight you never asked for and finally setting it down, even though setting it down might mean everything collapses. "Why?" she asked. "Why defend me? You could have let the archers fire. Let Velmora clean up her own mess. Maintained plausible deniability." Vaelor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something she hadn't heard before. Honesty. "Because I've spent my entire reign being what my father demanded. The perfect sovereign. Untouchable. Ruthless. Making every decision based on what preserved stability rather than what was right." He looked at her. "And when I saw you standing there, burning with proof that everything I'd been taught was built on lies, I realized something. I was tired of being perfect. Tired of pretending legitimacy comes from blood purity and inherited authority." That's a pretty expensive revelation. Most important revelations are. They heard footsteps echoing from somewhere in the palace above. Running. Organized. The sound of soldiers mobilizing. "We need to move," Seris said. They descended into the service passages. Dark, narrow. The kind of spaces designed for people who weren't supposed to be seen. Fitting, considering what they'd both become. "Where are we going?" Seris asked again. "The frontier," Vaelor said. "Your territory, where imperial authority is more suggestion than law." "That's a 3-week journey. Then we should start now." They moved through darkness, following passages that led away from the palace, away from crowns and councils and the comfortable machinery of power. Behind them, they could hear the empire starting to fracture. Shouts, orders, the chaos that happens when carefully maintained control suddenly shatters. Ahead was only uncertainty. No allies, no plan, no guarantee they'd survive the next 24 hours. But for the first time in his life, Vaelor felt something unexpected. Free. Not happy. Not safe. Not confident. Just free from the crushing weight of being what everyone else needed him to be. They emerged from the passages into the capital's lower districts, where commoners lived and imperial gold rarely reached, streets that smelled like sweat and cooking fires, and the honest reality of survival. Seris looked at Vaelor in his black ceremonial armor that probably cost more than most of these families made in a decade. "You're going to stand out," she said. "I'm aware." And they're going to recognize you. Also aware. So what's the plan? Vaelor looked around, at faces that were watching them with suspicion and curiosity, at the street that represented everything the palace spent its energy pretending didn't exist. Survive until morning, he said, then improvise. That's not a plan. It's the best I have. Seris started to respond, then stopped, because something in the crowd shifted. A woman stepped forward, old, scarred, the kind of weathered that comes from decades of hard living. She looked at Vaelor, at his armor, at his face that had been on imperial currency for 15 years. You're the king, she said. Not a question. I was, Vaelor replied. And you? The woman turned to Seris. You're the Solaryn girl, the one who burned the arena. That's me. The old woman studied them both, measuring, calculating something internal. Then she smiled, gap-toothed, genuine. Well, she said, this ought to be interesting. She turned and started walking. After a few steps, she looked back. You coming? Streets aren't safe for fallen kings and resurrected bloodlines, especially not together. Vaelor and Seris exchanged glances. We don't have better options, Seris said quietly. That seems to be a theme, Vaelor replied. They followed the old woman into the maze of lower district streets, away from imperial glory, away from the palace that had defined Vaelor's entire existence, into whatever came after everything you knew revealed itself to be built on lies. Above them, in the palace, Chancellor Velmora was already making moves, calling in favors, activating networks that had taken decades to build, preparing the kind of response that would make execution look like mercy. Because empires don't forgive rebels, they erase them. And then they rewrite history so thoroughly that future generations never know rebellion was even possible. The old woman led them to a building that looked abandoned from the outside but housed something else entirely. A network. People who existed in gaps the empire created. Refugees from consolidation wars. Survivors of bloodline purges. Everyone who'd been told they didn't matter and decided visibility was worth the risk. Welcome, the old woman said, opening a door that led into warm light and crowded rooms. To the people your empire forgot to eliminate. Vaelor stepped inside and realized with perfect clarity that he'd just crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Behind him was sovereignty. Ahead was truth. And truth, as it turned out, came with a price that crowns couldn't calculate. The safe house smelled like unwashed bodies and desperation. Not the romantic kind of resistance headquarters you read about in history books. No inspiring speeches or noble martyrs plotting revolution over candlelight. Just 37 people crammed into a space meant for 12, surviving in the gaps between imperial attention spans. Vaelor stood near a window that had been covered with cloth to block sightlines from the street. His ceremonial armor felt absurd here. Pompous, like wearing a crown to a funeral. The old woman who'd led them here introduced herself as Kara. No last name, no family lineage, just Kara. The kind of name you give yourself when your real one gets dangerous to speak aloud. She offered them water that tasted like rust and stale hope. You're a long way from velvet thrones, Kara said, watching Vaelor with eyes that missed nothing. What's a king doing slumming with forgotten bloodlines? Learning, Vaelor replied, expensive education. Most important ones are. Kara smiled at that. Recognition passing between them. The acknowledgement that truth costs more than comfort ever did. Seris sat in a corner, her fire completely gone now. Just exhaustion settling into her bones like sediment. The transformation in the arena had burned through energy she didn't know she had. Now she felt hollow, used up, like paper that had been written on too many times. How many people know about this place? Vaelor asked. Enough to keep it functional, few enough to keep it secret. Kara poured herself water. We've been operating for 6 years, moving refugees, hiding bloodlines the Empire decided were inconvenient. You'd be surprised how many families get erased from history while history is still being written. I wouldn't, Vaelor said quietly. The words hung heavy, because he'd signed some of those erasure orders himself. Not personally, but through chancellors and advisors who brought him documents that required royal seal. Clean language, bureaucratic necessity, strategic consolidation, never murder, always efficiency. That's how empires maintain the fiction of civilization. They industrialize brutality until it looks like policy. We need to reach the frontier, Seris said from her corner. Vaelor's authority there is weak enough that we might have breathing room. Time to figure out what the hell we're doing. 3 weeks on foot, Kara replied. 2 if you're willing to risk main roads. Which you're not. Every checkpoint between here and there will have your descriptions by morning. So we're trapped, Vaelor said. You're inconveniently located. Different problem. A younger man entered from another room, mid-20s, carrying scars that suggested military training and a face that suggested he'd left that life behind violently. Kara, he said, we have a situation. We have several. This one involves Imperial guards 3 blocks away conducting street-by-street searches. The room went quiet. That particular quality of silence that happens when danger stops being theoretical and becomes immediate. How long do we have? Kara asked. 20 minutes, maybe less. She turned to Vaelor and Seris. There's a smuggling route, goes through old aqueduct systems beneath the city, opens up 2 miles outside the eastern gate. Not pleasant, but functional. What's the catch? Seris asked. Costs money, significant money. I'm a king, Vaelor said. Money isn't... He stopped. Because money meant imperial accounts, which meant transactions that could be traced, which meant leading executioners directly to anyone who helped them. Wealth is only useful when you can access it without consequences. Otherwise, it's just numbers and ledgers you'll never see again. I have nothing, Vaelor finished. Kara looked at him, really looked. At the king who just realized that sovereignty without infrastructure was just a fancy word for homeless. No, she said slowly. You have something better than money. What? Information. You know things. Troop movements, supply routes, which noble houses are actually loyal versus which ones are just performing loyalty for advantage. Vaelor's jaw tightened. You want me to betray Imperial secrets? I want you to pay for passage. Whether that's betrayal or honesty depends entirely on your perspective. The choice sat between them like something physical. Everything Vaelor had been raised to protect. Every doctrine of sovereignty his father had beaten into him. Every principle that separated order from chaos, against immediate survival. Give me 10 minutes to think, he said. You have 5. Guards are moving fast. Vaelor walked to the covered window, pulled the cloth aside just enough to see the street below. Imperial soldiers moving through the district with systematic precision, checking buildings, questioning residents, hunting. He'd ordered operations like this himself, dozens of times, pursuing rebels, tracking fugitives, eliminating threats to stability, never once considering what it looked like from the other side, how it felt to be the target of machinery designed to be inescapable. Seris moved beside him. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. You could walk out there, tell them I coerced you, restore your position. We already had this conversation. That was an hour ago. Things change. Not that fast. He let the cloth fall back. I've spent 15 years making decisions based on what preserved the empire, what maintained stability, what kept the machinery of power functioning. Vaelor turned to face her, and it never occurred to me that maybe the machinery was the problem. That stability built on erasure isn't stable. It's just delayed collapse. Philosophical revelations are great, Seris said, but we're running out of time for philosophy. I know. He walked back to Kara. Imperial Supply Depot at the Eastern Garrison. They rotate guards every 8 days. Next rotation is in 3 days. During the changeover, security gets sloppy. 2-hour window where someone competent could walk out with enough weapons and provisions to supply a small uprising. Kara's expression didn't change. That's good information. That's treason. Depends on who's writing the definition. Vaelor felt something break inside him. Not collapse. Just crack. The way ice breaks when temperature shifts. He'd crossed so many lines today, they'd started blurring together. What was one more? We leave now, Kara said, standing. Jovan will guide you through the aqueducts. Stay quiet. Stay together. Don't touch the water if you can help it. Some of what flows through there isn't compatible with continued living. Encouraging, Seris muttered. I don't trade in encouragement. I trade in functional survival. Jovan, the scarred man from earlier, gathered supplies. Dark cloaks, cloth to wrap around boots for silence, Knives that looked well used. They descended into the aqueduct system through a hidden entrance in the safe house basement, stone stairs worn smooth by centuries of use. The smell hit immediately. Sewage and rot and something chemical that made Vaelor's eyes water. "Welcome to the real city," Jovan said, his voice echoing off stone. "The part that doesn't make it into imperial paintings." They walked through darkness, following Jovan's memorized path. Water ran in channels on either side. Dark, moving slowly, carrying things Vaelor chose not to identify. "How often do you use these routes?" Seris asked. 3-4 times a week. Moving people the Empire wants disappeared. You make it sound noble. It's not. It's just less evil than the alternative. Morality gets complicated when survival becomes the only mathematics that matters. When choosing between bad options and worse ones stops feeling like choosing and starts feeling like drowning in increments. They walked for 30 minutes through tunnels that twisted and branched. Jovan navigated without hesitation, left at intersections that all looked identical, right through passages that seemed to lead nowhere. Then he stopped, held up a hand. Everyone froze. "Voices," he whispered. "Ahead." Vaelor listened, caught fragments of conversation echoing through the tunnel system, too distant to make out words but close enough to identify tone. Imperial guards. They'd sent soldiers into the aqueducts. "They're covering more ground than usual," Jovan said quietly. "Someone's pushing them hard." "Velmora," Seris said. "She's not subtle when she wants something dead." "How many exits are there?" Vaelor asked. "From here?" 3. One's behind us and compromised. One's ahead past the guard patrol. One's through a side passage, but it opens into the noble district. You'd be recognized in seconds. So we're trapped. We're inconveniently located. Vaelor almost smiled despite circumstances. That seems to be a recurring theme. Jovan studied the tunnel ahead, calculating, measuring odds that probably didn't favor any of them. "I can draw them off," he said finally. "Lead them deeper into the system. Buy you time to reach the eastern exit." "That's suicide," Seris said. "It's probability management. I know these tunnels better than they do. Might survive. Might not. But you definitely won't if we all stay here." "We're not asking you to die for us," Vaelor said. "You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference." Jovan met Vaelor's eyes, something passing between them. Recognition, maybe, of the kind of choice that doesn't leave room for alternatives. "The Empire erased my family 8 years ago," Jovan said. "Consolidation war. My parents refused to surrender farmland, so Imperial soldiers made them an example. Burned everything, everyone." He adjusted his grip on his knife. "I was 12. Survived because I was small enough to hide in a grain cellar. Spent 8 years learning how to be invisible, how to help other people disappear before the Empire could erase them too." "I'm sorry," Vaelor said. "You should be. You signed the campaign orders." The words hit like physical blows. Vaelor felt his chest tighten, felt the weight of every document he'd approved without question, every strategic necessity that turned real people into acceptable casualties. "I didn't know," he said. "You didn't ask." "Different problem." Jovan started moving toward the guard patrol. "Eastern exit. 2 more turns. You'll know it when you see daylight." Then he was gone, running toward voices, shouting something about intruders to pull attention his direction. Combat sounds echoed through the tunnels. Shouts, clashing metal, then silence. The kind that feels heavy. Seris grabbed Vaelor's arm. "Move. Don't make his choice meaningless." They ran, through tunnels that smelled like death and decades of urban decay, toward daylight that appeared as a gray rectangle in the distance. They emerged 2 miles outside the city walls, farmland stretching toward frontier territories, sky beginning to lighten with approaching dawn. Behind them, the capital rose like a monument to power built on foundation cracks. "We should keep moving," Seris said. "They'll expand search perimeter once they realize we're not in the aqueducts." Vaelor stood looking back at the city, at the palace visible in the distance, at everything he'd ruled and everything he'd lost in the span of 12 hours. "Do you think he survived?" he asked quietly. "Jovan?" "No." The honesty hurt worse than comforting lies would have. He died for nothing, Vaelor said. We're just two people running. We don't have resources, don't have allies, don't have a plan. His sacrifice bought us maybe 6 hours. He died for something that mattered to him, Seris corrected. That's not nothing. How do you figure? Because he chose. Nobody forced him. Nobody manipulated him. He saw a situation and decided his life was worth spending on giving us a chance. She started walking toward the frontier. That's more agency than most people get. More meaning than dying because someone in a palace decided your existence was inconvenient. Vaelor followed. They walked through farmland as dawn painted the sky in shades that should have been beautiful, but just looked cold. Exhaustion settled into both of them, the kind that's physical and psychological simultaneously. What's the plan? Seris asked after an hour of silence. Reach the frontier, find allies, figure out what the hell we're fighting for besides immediate survival. That's vague. It's honest. They found an abandoned barn 3 hours outside the city. Collapsed roof, rotting wood. But shelter from sightlines and wind. Vaelor collapsed against a wall, removed his ceremonial armor piece by piece. Black steel that had represented sovereignty now just felt like weight. I killed him, he said. Who? Yovan. I killed him the same way I killed his family 8 years ago, by making decisions without considering cost. Seris sat across from him. You want absolution? I don't have any to give. You did sign those orders. You did enable consolidation wars that erased entire communities. Then why are you here? Why help me? Because people are complicated. You're a king who enabled atrocities through bureaucratic distance. You're also the only person with enough authority and knowledge to actually change how the empire functions, if you survive. She pulled her knees to her chest. I don't forgive you, but I need you. There's a difference. That's brutally honest. I don't have energy for comfortable lies. They rested in the barn while the sun climbed, took turns keeping watch, ate dried rations that Yovan had packed, barely spoke because words felt expensive. Late afternoon, Seris spotted movement on the road. Not Imperial soldiers, refugees, maybe a dozen, moving slowly, carrying everything they owned in bundles and carts. Coming from the capital, she said. Vaelor joined her at the barn wall, watched the refugees pass within 50 yards of their hiding spot. One woman was crying. Not dramatically, just steady tears that suggested she'd run out of other options. What happened? Vaelor asked. You happened, Seris said. The arena happened. Everything that came after. Empire's probably cracking down on anyone who might be sympathetic to resurrected bloodlines. Anyone who looks like they might question authority. So I didn't just destroy my own life. I destroyed theirs too. You revealed what was always true. The Empire maintains control through fear. When that fear gets challenged, the mask comes off and brutality becomes visible. She watched the refugees disappear down the road. You didn't create the problem. You just stopped pretending it wasn't there. They waited until dusk before moving again, traveling at night, sleeping in hidden places during daylight. The pattern of people who couldn't afford to be seen. 3 days passed like that, moving through farmland toward frontier territories, avoiding main roads, trading information with travelers who seemed sympathetic or at least not immediately hostile. News from the capital filtered through. Chancellor Velmora had declared martial law. Anyone harboring fugitives faced execution. Noble houses were being pressured to declare loyalty publicly. The empire was consolidating, preparing for something. War. Not against external enemies, against internal threat. Against the possibility that maybe sovereignty wasn't absolute and legitimacy wasn't inherited. On the fourth night, they reached the frontier border station, a checkpoint that marked where imperial authority started, becoming suggestion rather than law, where order gave way to the kind of organized chaos that frontier territories specialized in. Vaelor expected resistance, expected guards who'd recognize him, expected arrest. Instead, the checkpoint was abandoned, buildings empty, gates hanging open, equipment scattered like people had left in a hurry. This is wrong, Seris said, hand moving to her blade. Agreed. They moved through the checkpoint carefully, every instinct screaming ambush, every shadow potentially hiding threat. They found the bodies in the command building. 6 guards, executed, professional work, quick, efficient, and on the wall, written in blood that was still wet. "Welcome home, King." Vaelor's blood went cold. "Someone knew we were coming," Seris said. "Someone's been tracking us since we left the capital." "Velmora? She doesn't work this way. Too personal, too dramatic." Vaelor studied the message. The handwriting. The way blood had been applied with deliberate care. Recognition hit him like ice water. "Maelor, Tiam," he said. Seris turned sharply. "Maelor, the guardian who gave me the blood awakening. He's helping us." "Is he?" The question hung in the air between them. Seris felt something crack in her chest. That specific kind of breaking that happens when trust reveals itself to be built on assumptions rather than evidence. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we've been moving through the Empire for 4 days without getting caught, despite Velmora's resources. We've found shelter exactly when we needed it. We've avoided patrols that should have found us." Vaelor walked to the window. "Either we're incredibly lucky, or someone's been guiding us, making sure we survive just long enough to reach exactly where they want us. Maelor gave me the blood awakening, showed me my heritage. He's the reason I survived the monastery attack." "Did he, though? Or did he give you just enough power to make you visible? Just enough truth to make you dangerous? Just enough hope to keep you moving in the direction he wanted?" The words felt like accusations. Because they were. "You're saying he's using me." "I'm saying guardians of extinct bloodlines don't usually survive multiple imperial purges by being careless. They survive by being strategic." Seris felt her hand shaking. Not from fear, from rage. Because if Vaelor was right, if Maelor had been manipulating her since the beginning, then everything she'd done, every choice she'd made, every person who'd died helping her, had been pieces in someone else's game. "Why?" she asked. "Why would he do that?" "Because you're Solaryn blood. The last heir to a house that nearly toppled the Empire. If someone wanted to restart that war, you'd be the perfect weapon, the perfect symbol. So what, I'm just a tool? A convenient piece of resurrected mythology? You're powerful. That makes you useful. And useful people rarely get to decide who uses them." Footsteps echoed from outside the building. Multiple people, moving with military precision. Vaelor drew his blade. Seris felt fire kindle beneath her skin. The door opened. Maelor stepped inside. Behind him, 20 soldiers in armor that didn't carry imperial marks. Independent fighters. Mercenaries, maybe. Or true believers in a cause Seris was only beginning to understand. "Seris," Maelor said, his voice warm, familiar. The same tone he'd used teaching her about her bloodline in the monastery. "I'm glad you made it. The journey was difficult, I imagine." "You killed these guards," she said. "I cleared obstacles. Different phrasing. You've been tracking us. I've been ensuring your survival. You're far too valuable to leave to chance and imperial incompetence." Maelor walked further into the room, relaxed, confident, like someone who'd already won and was just waiting for everyone else to realize it. "You're angry," he said. "I understand. Trust is complicated when revelation comes in stages." "You used me," Seris said, fire starting to manifest around her hands. "I awakened you. There's a difference. You manipulated everything. The monastery attack, the trial. All of it staged to make me visible, to make me dangerous. To make you what you were always meant to be," Maelor corrected. "The spark that reignites a war the Empire thought it had extinguished." He gestured to the soldiers behind him. "House Solaryn didn't die. It went underground. Spent 12 generations rebuilding in shadows, waiting for the moment when the Empire's arrogance created opportunity." His eyes shifted to Vaelor. "And what better opportunity than the king himself defecting, abandoning his throne to protect Solaryn blood? The symbolism is perfect. The narrative writes itself." Vaelor's grip tightened on his blade. "You engineered this entire thing." "Not entirely. I couldn't predict you'd grow a conscience. That was unexpected. But useful." Maelor smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "You understand political theater, Your Majesty. You know that revolutions need symbols. Seris is the resurrected bloodline. You're the crown that chose truth over empire. Together, your mythology made flesh." "And if we refuse?" Seris asked. Then you die, and I find the next heir in the Solaryn line. There are others, less powerful, less charismatic, but functional. He walked closer to Seris. You've already made your choice. When you awakened your blood, when you burned the arena, when you rejected the Empire's offer of comfortable oblivion, you chose visibility, and visibility in politics means becoming a symbol whether you want to or not. I chose survival. Survival is how every revolution starts. No one sets out to burn empires. They just refuse to die quietly. And refusal, when it's loud enough, becomes war. Seris looked at Vaelor, at the king who'd given up everything based on principles he was only beginning to understand, who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, who was looking at her with an expression that said he'd follow whatever choice she made, even if it killed them both. We need time, Seris said. You don't have time, Vaelor replied. The Empire is mobilizing. Velmora is consolidating power. Every hour you wait, the trap closes tighter. He gestured to his soldiers. I'm offering you an army, resources, strategic positioning, everything you need to actually fight instead of just running. In exchange for what? For being what you already are. Solaryn blood, resurrected threat. The face of a movement that will remind the Empire why it spent so much energy making sure your house stayed dead. The mathematics was brutal in its simplicity. Refuse and die as fugitives, hunted, eliminated, forgotten. Accept and become weapons in a war they didn't start and couldn't control. Seris felt trapped between impossible choices, between agency and survival, between truth and utility. I need to think, she said. You have until dawn, Vaelor replied. After that, I move forward with or without you. The revolution is happening. You just get to decide whether you're leading it or fertilizing it. He left with his soldiers. The door closed. Seris and Vaelor stood in silence among dead guards and blood-written messages, and the wreckage of every assumption they'd made about who was controlling their lives. So, Vaelor said finally, that's significantly worse than I anticipated. Seris almost laughed, except nothing was funny. He's right, though, she said quietly. About the choices. About visibility, meaning we're already symbols regardless of what we want. Symbols get worshipped or executed, rarely anything in between. So what do we do? Vaelor looked at her, at the woman wrapped in inherited power she'd never asked for, at the bloodline that had become weapon before she had a chance to become anything else. We survive until we figure out how to be human again, instead of mythology, he said. That's not a plan. It's the only one that doesn't make us someone else's tool. Outside, night deepened toward dawn. Somewhere in the capital, Velmora was making moves that would reshape the Empire. Somewhere in the darkness, Vaelor was preparing a war. And between them, two people who'd never asked to be legends stood in an abandoned checkpoint, trying to figure out how to be something other than the roles everyone else had written for them. The choice was simple and impossible. Accept becoming weapons and gain power to survive. Refuse and die maintaining agency that wouldn't matter once they were dead. There has to be another option, Seris said. Does theirs? She turned to face him. You gave up your throne, your authority, your entire life. For what? To become someone else's symbol? Someone else's tool? I gave it up to stop being a tool, Vaelor said. Being Velmora's tool or Maelor's tool isn't much different, just different masters. So we run. Where? The Empire's behind us. Maelor's in front. We're out of geography. Seris felt fire kindle beneath her skin, not from conscious choice, from rage, from the fundamental injustice of surviving everything only to discover that survival itself had been orchestrated. Then we break the board, she said. What? The game, Maelor's game, Velmora's game, Empire versus Revolution, symbol versus symbol. We refuse to play. That's suicide. So is every other option. She moved to the window, looked out at frontier darkness. You know what the frontier teaches you? When you're cornered with no good choices, you make a third option. You change the terrain. You refuse the trap. How? Seris turned back to him. We do what neither Vaelor nor Velmora expects. We go public, real public, not as symbols, as people. We tell the truth. All of it. Your role in Consolidation Wars, my bloodline, Maelor's manipulation, Velmora's conspiracy, everything. That destroys us both. Maybe. Or maybe honesty is the one weapon they can't counter. Because it's not playing their game. It's not fighting for legitimacy or authority. It's just refusing to let anyone else write our story. Vaelor studied her face, saw desperation there and fury and something that might have been hope if hope could burn. That's the worst plan I've ever heard, he said. You have a better one? He didn't, because trapped between impossible choices, sometimes the only option is choosing the impossibility you can live with, even if you don't live long. We'll need a way to transmit the message, Vaelor said slowly. Something Maelor can't stop. Something that reaches enough people that killing us doesn't bury the truth. The frontier has networks, smuggler routes, information channels the Empire doesn't control. How long would it take? To organize? 2 days, maybe? Maelor gave us until dawn, that's 4 hours. Seris smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. Then I guess we better move fast. They left through the back of the checkpoint building, into Frontier Night where Imperial authority was more myth than mechanism. Behind them, Maelor and his soldiers waited for dawn. Ahead, the Empire prepared for whatever was coming, and between them, 2 people who'd been turned into weapons decided to become something more dangerous, human, with all the messy unpredictability that implied. The revolution Maelor wanted was coming, just not the one he'd planned. The Frontier Communication Hub sat half-buried in a hillside like something trying to hide from Imperial notice. Not impressive, just functional. Relay stations connected through old messenger networks that predated the Empire's centralized control. Information channels built by smugglers and merchants who understood that commerce required communication the Crown couldn't intercept. Seris and Vaelor reached it 2 hours before dawn. The operator was a woman named Tess, 50-something, missing 3 fingers on her left hand from what looked like a blade accident that had healed badly. She looked at them with the kind of suspicion that keeps people alive in places where trust gets you killed. We need to send a message, Seris said. Wide distribution. Every frontier settlement, every independent trade hub, every place the Empire doesn't control communication. Tess studied them both. Took her time about it. You're the ones from the capital, she said finally. King and the Solaryn girl. Word travels fast out here, faster than Imperial soldiers. Then you know we're being hunted, Vaelor said. I know you're worth a lot of money to anyone willing to collect bounties. Imperial gold spends well even in places that hate the Empire. She crossed her arms. Why should I risk my operation for 2 people I don't know and probably won't survive the week? Because what we're about to tell you will break the Empire's narrative, Seris replied. And broken narratives create opportunities for people smart enough to position themselves correctly. Tess smiled at that, gap-toothed and genuine. Now, that's honest. I respect honest. She gestured them inside. The communication hub was larger than it looked from outside. 3 rooms connected by narrow passages, equipment that looked cobbled together from salvaged parts and stubborn engineering, maps covering walls showing relay points and transmission routes. What kind of message? Tess asked. Truth, Vaelor said. Raw, unfiltered. Everything the Empire has spent centuries burying. That's vague. I signed consolidation war orders that erased entire communities. Called it strategic necessity. Never questioned the cost. His voice was flat, factual. The tone of someone past pretense. Seris is the last heir to House Solaryn. A bloodline the Empire exterminated 12 generations ago and then erased from history. She survived because her family spent a century disappearing. And someone named Maelor has been manipulating both of us, Seris added, orchestrating our visibility to restart a war, using us as symbols without consent. Tess let out a low whistle. That's explosive. That's the point, Vaelor said. Also suicidal. That too. Tess walked to her equipment, ran her hand over transmission devices that hummed with low power. This goes out, you can't take it back. Every faction in the Empire will have ammunition against you. Velmora will use your confession. Maelor will see it as betrayal. Noble houses will smell blood in the water. We know, Seris said. And you're doing it anyway? We're doing it because we're out of options that don't make us someone else's weapon, Vaelor replied. This way, at least we control the narrative, even if the narrative destroys us. There's something fascinating about people who choose honesty when lies would serve them better. Not because they're noble, because they're desperate. Because when every alternative requires becoming something you can't live with, truth becomes the only option that preserves whatever's left of your humanity. Even if that humanity doesn't survive the disclosure. Tess considered them both for a long moment. I'll need 2 hours to set up proper distribution. Make sure the message reaches critical mass before anyone can intercept and shut it down. We have 2 hours before Maelor's deadline, Seris said. Then we're on a tight schedule. Tess started working, adjusting equipment, sending preliminary signals to relay stations, building a network that would carry their message beyond anyone's ability to contain it. Vaelor and Seris sat in the corner of the main room, exhaustion settling into their bones like sediment. This is going to end badly, Vaelor said quietly. Probably. We'll be hated. By everyone. Empire loyalists for my confession, resistance fighters for exposing Maelor, anyone who wanted us to be symbols. Yes. So why does it feel right? Seris looked at him. At the king who'd given up everything without knowing what came after. Who'd chosen uncertainty over comfortable lies. Because it's ours, she said. The choice. The consequence. All of it. Nobody else wrote this. Nobody else orchestrated it. For the first time since this started, we're not playing someone else's game. We're just destroying ourselves on our own terms. It's not much, but it's something. They sat in silence while Tess worked, while dawn crept closer, while the deadline Maelor had set ticked down toward confrontation they couldn't avoid. An hour before dawn, Tess finished setup. Ready when you are, she said. Say what you need to say. I'll make sure it reaches everywhere that matters. Vaelor stood, walked to the transmission device, looked at the simple equipment that would carry words into hundreds of locations simultaneously. He'd spent 15 years crafting careful speeches, diplomatic language designed to project strength without revealing weakness. Every word measured, every sentence calculated. This required something different. This required standing naked in front of an empire and admitting everything he'd been, everything he'd done, everything he'd enabled through willful ignorance. I'm Vaelor Draven, he said into the transmission device, King of the Seven Crowns Dominion. Or I was. I'm not sure what I am now besides someone who spent 15 years being exactly what my father demanded. Perfect, ruthless, untouchable. His voice was steady, clear. I signed orders that erased communities, called them consolidation wars, strategic necessity, acceptable losses. I never questioned whether the necessity was real or whether I was just maintaining machinery built on inherited brutality. He paused. Seris Virell stands beside me. She's the last known heir to House Solaryn, a bloodline my ancestors exterminated 12 generations ago because they threatened imperial authority. The history books call it peacekeeping. It was genocide, calm, clean, bureaucratic, justified through the same language I used approving campaigns that killed families who refused to surrender land. Seris felt something tighten in her chest, listening to Vaelor dismantle himself publicly, strip away every carefully constructed layer of sovereignty. We're being hunted, Vaelor continued, by Chancellor Velmora, who tried to have us both killed, by a man named Maelor, who's been manipulating events to restart a war using us as symbols, by an empire that can't tolerate the possibility that maybe legitimacy isn't inherited and power isn't absolute. His hand tightened on the transmission device. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for support. I'm just telling you what I finally understand after 15 years of ruling without questioning. The empire is built on lies, carefully maintained lies, and those lies require constant violence to preserve. I was that violence, dressed in ceremony, justified through tradition, but violence nonetheless. He looked at Seris. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if we survive tomorrow. I just know I'm tired of being a tool in someone else's machine. Tired of pretending sovereignty makes cruelty acceptable. Seris stepped forward, took the transmission device. I'm Seris Virell, she said. Border-born, military-trained, last heir to a house that was exterminated for threatening imperial consolidation. I didn't choose this bloodline. I didn't choose the power that comes with it. I just chose not to die quietly when the Empire decided I was inconvenient. Her voice carried the rough edges of someone past diplomacy. Vaelor gave me truth, but truth with strings attached. Truth designed to make me a weapon. He wants a war, wants to use my bloodline as justification for violence that will kill thousands, maybe more. I refuse. The words came out hard. I refuse to be a symbol, refuse to be a tool, refuse to let anyone use my existence as excuse for more death. The Empire is corrupt. Vaelor's resistance is manipulative. Both of them want to use us for their own purposes. She paused. So we're choosing neither. We're choosing honesty, choosing to be complicated human beings instead of mythology, choosing to let you decide what happens next instead of letting powerful people make decisions behind closed doors. If you want revolution, build it yourselves. Don't wait for symbols to lead you. If you want reform, demand it. Don't wait for kings to volunteer change. We're just two people who refuse to disappear. Everything else is up to you. Seris set down the transmission device. Tess hit the broadcast trigger, and the message went out. Through relay stations, through messenger networks, through every communication channel the Frontier used to stay connected despite Imperial control, spreading like fire through dry brush, irreversible, uncontainable. The kind of truth that changes everything just by existing. Tess looked at them both. Well, she said, that's done. Now comes the interesting part. What's that? Vaelor asked. Surviving what you just started. The sun broke the horizon. Maelor's deadline passed, and outside the communication hub, they heard movement. Not soldiers, something worse. Vaelor himself, with his 20 fighters, surrounding the building with the kind of precision that suggested they'd been watching, waiting, knowing exactly where Vaelor and Seris had gone. Because of course they did. Because Vaelor didn't survive 12 generations of Imperial purges by being careless. He survived by being 12 steps ahead of everyone else. His voice carried through the morning air. Seris, Your Majesty, I heard your broadcast, quite moving, quite honest, quite catastrophically stupid. Vaelor moved to the door, opened it. Vaelor stood 30 yards away, relaxed, confident. Behind him, his fighters had weapons drawn but not raised, ready but not aggressive. You had one job, Vaelor said. Survive. Stay useful. Let me build the infrastructure that would have given you actual power instead of symbolic martyrdom. We don't want power, Seris said, stepping beside Vaelor. Everyone wants power. They just call it different things. Justice, freedom, self-determination. It's all power, just dressed in more comfortable language. He walked closer, 5 yards, then stopped. You think your honesty changes anything? You think telling the Empire that you're complicated human beings instead of symbols makes you less useful? Vaelor smiled. You're more useful now. Martyrs who died for truth instead of symbols who died for politics. The narrative writes itself. You're going to kill us, Vaelor said. Not a question. I'm going to give you a chance to die meaningfully, fighting against impossible odds, refusing to surrender, the perfect ending to the story I've been writing. We're not your story. Everyone's someone's story. You just get to pick whether you're a tragedy or a comedy. I prefer tragedies. They inspire better revolutions. Vaelor gestured to his fighters. Last chance. Join me. Lead the movement I've built. Use your voice for something besides self-destruction. Pass, Seris said. Then you die here. And I use your deaths as evidence that the Empire can't tolerate truth. That even reformed kings and resurrected bloodlines get eliminated for threatening the machinery. He drew his blade. Nothing personal, just necessary mathematics. There's a moment before violence when everything crystallizes, when training and instinct and desperation compress into single-minded purpose, when philosophy stops mattering and survival becomes the only equation that counts. Seris felt fire kindle beneath her skin. Not consciously summoned, just responding to threat, the way breathing responds to oxygen deprivation. Automatic. Essential. Vaelor drew his blade. The sword he'd carried through 6 campaigns, border steel instead of ceremonial black steel because the ceremonial armor had been abandoned days ago. Just a weapon. Just a man. Just whatever was left after sovereignty got stripped away. Tess, Vaelor said quietly. Get inside, lock the doors. This isn't your fight. Like hell, Tess replied. She produced a crossbow from somewhere. Old, well-maintained, the kind of weapon that suggested she'd survive frontier life through competence rather than luck. "Your funeral," Vaelor said. Then he attacked. Not personally. He was too smart for that. Too strategic. He gestured, and his fighters advanced. 20 professional soldiers against 3 people who were exhausted, outmatched, and out of options. The mathematics was brutal. But mathematics doesn't account for desperation. Doesn't account for people who've already lost everything except the choice of how they die. Doesn't account for rage sharpened by betrayal into something that cuts deeper than any blade. Seris met the first wave with fire that exploded outward like something alive. Not wild, controlled. Years of military training channeled through ancestral power that predated steel. Flames formed barriers, created walls, turned ground into molten glass that fighters couldn't cross. She wasn't trying to kill, wasn't trying to win, just trying to survive long enough to matter. Beside her, Vaelor fought with the kind of precision that had made him legendary. Every movement economical. Every strike designed to disable rather than destroy. But even legends get tired. Even precision fails when overwhelmed by numbers. A blade got through his guard, cut his shoulder, not deep, but enough to matter. Blood ran down his arm, warm, real. The kind of reminder that kings bleed the same as everyone else once sovereignty gets removed. Tess fired her crossbow, reloaded, fired again, professional, economical. Buying time measured in seconds rather than minutes. The fight consumed them all. There's something clarifying about combat when you know you're losing. When survival stops being about victory and starts being about making the defeat costly enough to matter. Every second becomes precious. Every breath stolen from inevitability. Every moment where you're still standing proof that ending you required effort. A fighter got past Seris's fire barrier. She met him with a blade she'd taken from a fallen guard days ago. Border steel against whatever training he'd received. He was better, more skilled, more experienced, more everything except desperate. And desperation, as it turns out, is its own kind of training. The fighter fell. Seris didn't remember the specific movements, didn't remember the technique, just remembered being alive when he wasn't. That's combat. That's what it reduces to when philosophy and strategy burn away. You're alive or you're not. Everything else is commentary. Vaelor took down 3 fighters, 4, his shoulder bleeding steadily, his breathing getting labored, exhaustion turning every movement into deliberate effort, but still moving, still fighting, still refusing to kneel. Because some people break under pressure, some people surrender, some people negotiate, and some people burn bright enough that forcing them down requires witnessing them fight every inch. Vaelor watched from distance, not engaging, just observing, calculating, measuring how much his symbol cost before she became a martyr. Then Vaelmora arrived, not subtly, with 50 Imperial soldiers, with the full weight of crown authority that she'd consolidated during Vaelor's absence. With the machinery of empire turned into weapons specifically designed to eliminate threats that diplomacy couldn't contain. The frontier outpost was surrounded. Vaelor's fighters, Vaelmora's soldiers, and in the middle, 3 people who'd somehow become the focal point of conflicts that predated their births. Vaelmora stepped forward, immaculate, poised, every inch the picture of civilized authority. "How convenient," she said. "All my problems in one location." She looked at Vaelor, the revolutionary guardian manipulating resurrected bloodlines. Then at Vaelor, the king who chose sentiment over stability. Then at Seris, and the weapon everyone wants to claim. Her smile was cold, calculated. "I could kill you all here. Call it suppressing rebellion. Write it into history as necessary violence." She paused. "Or I could be creative." Vaelmora gestured to her soldiers. They advanced on Vaelor's fighters. Not attacking, just positioning. Creating a perimeter that trapped everyone inside. "Here's what's going to happen," Vaelmora said. "You're going to kill each other. Vaelor's revolution against the failed king and his dangerous weapon. I'll document everything. Use it as evidence that reform is impossible. That the empire must maintain absolute control because look what happens when authority fractures." "You're insane," Vaelor said. "I'm efficient. There's a difference." She walked closer. Close enough that Seris could see the absolute certainty in her eyes. the kind of confidence that comes from spending decades manipulating power. I win regardless of outcome. If Vaelor kills you, I eliminate him and absorb his movement as cautionary tale. If you kill him, I execute you for murder and revolutionary conspiracy. Either way, I consolidate authority, and the empire continues.
You really think you've accounted for every variable? Seris asked. I've accounted for the ones that matter. Then you're not as smart as you think. Seris raised her hand. Fire spiraled upward. Not attacking, not threatening, just visible. A column of flame that rose into morning sky like a beacon that could be seen for miles. What are you doing? Vaelor demanded. Making sure everyone's watching, Seris replied. Because the message they'd sent wasn't just words. It was invitation. It was signal. It was proof that maybe the Empire's control wasn't as absolute as everyone believed. And people who'd spent lifetimes being invisible started becoming visible. From the hillsides, from concealed positions, from places where imperial authority was suggestion rather than law. They came. Refugees from consolidation wars, survivors of bloodline purges. Families who'd been told they didn't matter. People who'd heard the broadcast and decided that maybe honesty was worth supporting. Not an army, not organized, just people, hundreds of them, maybe more. Surrounding the imperial soldiers, surrounding Vaelor's fighters, surrounding everything with the kind of presence that wasn't threatening, just undeniable. Vaelor's expression finally cracked. You think this changes anything? These are civilians, unarmed, untrained. They're witnesses, Vaelor said. You can kill us, but you can't kill them all. Not without proving everything we said was true. Not without showing the Empire that your control requires massacring everyone who questions it. I'll do what's necessary. Then do it in front of thousands of people who'll carry the story, who'll tell their children, who'll remember that the Empire slaughtered civilians to maintain power. Vaelor looked around, at the faces watching her, at the impossible mathematics of maintaining authority when authority required visible atrocity. This isn't over, she said. It never is, Seris replied. That's what you people never understand. You can't kill ideas once they're spoken. You can't disappear truth once it's visible. You can kill us. But what we said is already out there, already spreading, already making people question. Vaelor laughed. Bitter. Genuine. Clever, he said to Seris. Use the broadcast to create accountability. Make killing you too expensive. Force everyone to negotiate instead of eliminate. Learn from the best, Seris said. You taught me manipulation. I just used it honestly. There's no such thing as honest manipulation. Then I guess I'm making new definitions. The standoff held. Vaelor's fighters, Vaelmora's soldiers, hundreds of witnesses, and in the center 3 people who'd somehow turned their execution into something else. Negotiation. Or at least the possibility of it. Vaelmora's hand moved to her blade. Vaelor tensed. Seris felt fire ready beneath her skin. The crowd held its breath. And in that crystallized moment before everything exploded, before choice became violence, before the Empire's future got decided by whatever happened in the next 3 seconds, a voice cut through the tension. Stop. Everyone turned. From the crowd emerged a woman, old, weathered, carrying authority that didn't come from weapons or titles, just presence. The kind earned through surviving long enough to understand what actually mattered. I'm Elder Myrith, she said, Frontier Council, representative of settlements the Empire barely controls and mostly forgets. She walked into the center of the standoff, fearless, or maybe just too old to care about fear. You all want to kill each other, want to decide the Empire's future through violence, want to write history in blood. She looked at each of them in turn. But these people behind me, they have a say too. They've been dying in your wars, being erased in your consolidations, surviving in spaces you consider irrelevant. And they're tired. Myrith turned to address the crowd. You want reform? You want revolution? You want anything to change? Silence. Then a voice from the crowd. Yes. Another voice. Yes. More voices joining, building, until it became something that sounded like consensus emerging from chaos. Myrith turned back to Vaelor. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to let them live, all of them, and they're going to figure out what comes next without killing each other. And if I refuse, Vaelor asked, then you slaughter hundreds of witnesses and prove everything they said was true.
Your authority becomes massacre. Your empire becomes tyranny visible instead of tyranny dressed as civilization. Mireth stepped closer to Velmora. You're smart. You understand optics. You know that some victories cost more than they're worth. The standoff held. Velmora calculating, measuring, weighing immediate power against long-term control. Finally, she lowered her hand from her blade. 30 days, she said. Figure out what you want, what reforms you're demanding, what future you're proposing. Then we negotiate, like civilized people. And if we can't agree, Vaelor asked, then we go back to killing each other. But at least we'll have tried dialogue first. Velmora turned to her soldiers. Stand down. Perimeter security only. No engagement unless attacked. She looked back at Seris and Vaelor. 30 days. Don't waste them. Then she was gone, taking her soldiers, leaving the standoff transformed into something nobody had planned. Truce. Temporary. Fragile. Built on nothing except the mathematics that killing had become too expensive and witnesses too numerous. But truce nonetheless. Maelor sheathed his blade. This isn't over, he said to Seris. It never is, she replied. You cost me a revolution. You tried to cost me my humanity. Call it even. Maelor looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. You're more Solaryn than you realize. That ruthless pragmatism, that willingness to burn everything rather than surrender. I'm just me, Seris said. Everything else is history you're trying to write. History is already written. We just decide who remembers it. He left with his fighters, disappearing into frontier wilderness like shadow dissolving at dawn. The crowd began dispersing, slowly, reluctantly. The kind of gradual departure that happens when people aren't sure the danger's actually over. Elder Myreth approached Vaelor and Seris. That was reckless, she said. It worked, Seris replied. This time. Next time you might not have convenient witnesses. Then we'll figure something else out. Myreth studied them both, measuring something internal. 30 days, she said. That's what you bought. 30 days to figure out what comes next. Use them wisely. She paused. And for what it's worth, what you said in that broadcast, it mattered. People heard, people are questioning. That's more than anyone's accomplished in generations. Will it be enough? Vaelor asked. I don't know, but it's a start. Myreth left. The sun climbed higher, morning settling into day, the communication hub still standing despite everything. Tess emerged from inside, still carrying her crossbow, still looking like she might use it if anyone gave her reason. So, she said, that happened. Yeah, Seris replied. You two really know how to make a morning interesting. Vaelor looked at Seris, at the woman who'd transformed from weapon into something more complicated, who'd refused every role everyone tried to force on her. 30 days, he said. 30 days, she agreed. Any idea what we do with them? Not really. Figure it out as we go. That's a terrible plan. It's the only one we have. They stood in morning light, exhausted, bleeding, alive despite mathematics that said they shouldn't be. Behind them, an empire fractured into competing visions of what came next. Ahead, 30 days to figure out if honesty could actually build something instead of just burning everything down. And between them, something that might have been trust, or might have been just two people who'd survived enough together that they'd stopped being strangers. We should probably get that shoulder looked at, Seris said, gesturing to Vaelor's wound. Probably. And figure out where we're sleeping tonight. That too. And maybe eat something that isn't dried rations stolen from dead soldiers. Ambitious. Despite everything, Seris smiled. We just prevented 3 different factions from killing us through a combination of honesty and strategic manipulation. I think we can handle basic survival logistics. When you put it that way, they started walking, away from the communication hub, away from the scene of standoff that had almost killed them, toward whatever 30 days might offer. Behind them, history was being written, revised, argued about, the kind of messy process that happens when narratives fracture, and nobody's sure which version becomes truth. Ahead was uncertainty. No guarantees, no clear path, no promise that they'd survive whatever came after the 30-day truce. But for the first time since this started, they were walking towards something they'd chosen. Not away from threat, not towards symbol, not playing roles in someone else's story, just walking, together, into whatever came next. And somewhere in the distance, watching from shadows, powers that had shaped empires for generations were recalculating. Because two people who refused to die quietly had just done something more dangerous than rebelling. They'd told the truth. And truth, once spoken, never stops spreading. It just burns, slow, inevitable, until everything built on lies either transforms or collapses. 30 days is simultaneously forever and no time at all. Depends on what you're trying to build. Seris and Vaelor spent the first week just surviving, finding shelter in frontier settlements that offered grudging hospitality to people who'd become either heroes or disasters depending on who you asked. Eating meals with families who'd heard the broadcast and weren't sure what to make of a king who'd confessed his failures and a bloodline that refused to be a weapon. Healing. Physical wounds first. Vaelor's shoulder required actual medical attention, the kind frontier healers provided with herbs and stitches, and the blunt observation that kings bled exactly like everyone else once you got past the ceremony. Then the harder healing, the kind that doesn't show on skin. The second week, they started listening. Not talking, not proposing, not leading, just listening. To farmers who'd lost land in consolidation wars. To families who'd survived bloodline purges by changing names and forgetting history. To merchants who navigated imperial taxation that extracted wealth without providing security. To soldiers who'd followed orders and wondered later if following orders was sufficient justification for what those orders required. Every story added weight. Every testimony revealed another crack in the Empire's carefully maintained narrative. By the third week, patterns emerged. The Empire wasn't failing because it was evil. Evil is simple. Evil can be fought with righteousness and clear moral lines. The Empire was failing because it had optimized for control at the expense of everything else, had turned governance into machinery that processed people as inputs and extracted compliance as output, had confused stability with sustainability, and stability, as it turned out, was just another word for delayed collapse. Elder Myreth convened a council on the 21st day. Not formal, not official, just people gathering in a frontier meeting hall to figure out what came next. Representatives from settlements, merchants, soldiers, farmers. The people who made the Empire function in spaces where imperial authority was theoretical. Seris and Vaelor sat in the back, not at the head table, not positioned as leaders, just present, available, refusing the role everyone kept trying to assign them. "We need to present a unified proposal," said a merchant named Corvin. Mid-40s. Weathered hands that suggested he'd built his fortune through labor rather than inheritance. "Velmora gave us 30 days. We're running out of time." "Unified is the problem," replied a woman named Sashin. Former soldier. Scarred face that told stories she probably didn't share often. "The Empire wants us unified because unified is easy to target, easy to eliminate. We should stay fragmented, make suppression too expensive to execute." "That's survival, not change," Corvin argued. "Survival is prerequisite for change." The debate continued, voices rising, frustration building. The natural chaos that happens when people who've spent lifetimes being voiceless suddenly have to figure out what to say. Vaelor watched, measured, recognized patterns from 15 years of governance. This was how empires fractured, not through grand rebellions, through inability to build consensus when consensus became necessary. He stood. The room quieted. Not because he commanded it, because people were curious what a fallen king would say to a room full of people whose suffering he'd enabled. "I spent 15 years believing that authority came from clarity," Vaelor said, "from having answers, from knowing exactly what needed to happen and implementing it regardless of dissent." He walked to the center of the room. "I was wrong. Authority that can't tolerate questions is just tyranny wearing diplomatic language." He looked around at faces watching him, some hostile, some curious, some just exhausted. "You're arguing because you disagree. That's not weakness. That's proof you're actually trying to build something real instead of accepting whatever version someone else imposes." "That's nice philosophy," Sashin said. "Doesn't solve the practical problem. We have 9 days to present something to Velmora, or the truce ends and soldiers return." "Then don't present a solution," Seris said, speaking for the first time. "Present the problem." Everyone turned to look at her. Velmora wants a unified proposal because unified is easy to dismiss or co-opt. Give her complexity instead. Give her 50 proposals. 100. Show her that the Empire's problems aren't simple and solutions can't be imposed from above. That's chaos, Corvin said. That's honesty, Seris replied. The Empire is chaotic. Pretending it's not doesn't make governing easier. It just makes the chaos invisible until it explodes. She stood, moved to stand beside Vaelor. You want to know what we learned spending 3 weeks listening? There's no single answer. Farmers need different things than merchants. Soldiers need different things than families. Frontier settlements need different governance than cities. The Empire tried to flatten that complexity into uniform control. It failed. It's been failing for generations. You're just the first people with enough visibility to say it publicly. The room was quiet, processing. Then Elder Myreth spoke from her position at the head table. So we bring Velmora chaos. Show her that order isn't the same as control, that governance requires accommodating complexity rather than eliminating it. That's a risk, said another council member.
Everything's a risk, Myreth replied. We can risk honesty, or we can risk pretending simplicity exists. I prefer honesty. At least when it fails, we know why. The council talked for 6 more hours. Debated, argued. Gradually built not consensus, but something more useful. Acknowledgement that consensus might not be possible. That maybe governance required holding tension between competing needs rather than resolving tension through authority. It wasn't clean, wasn't simple. Wasn't the kind of proposal chancellors could implement through decree. But it was real. On the 28th day, they traveled to the negotiation site, a neutral location between frontier and capital. Old trading posts that had seen centuries of exchanges, where Empire met everything the Empire couldn't fully control. Velmora arrived with appropriate ceremony. 50 soldiers, advisors in formal dress, the machinery of power made visible. The frontier delegation arrived as themselves. No uniforms, no ceremony. Just people who'd survived long enough to demand being heard. The negotiations happened in a building that smelled like old wood and older compromises. Velmora sat at one end of a long table, the Frontier Council at the other. Between them, space for documents and proposals, and the kind of careful language that prevented words from becoming violence. Seris and Vaelor sat with the Frontier delegation, but not at its head. Just present, just visible, just refusing the role everyone expected. You have proposals, Velmora said. Not a question. Elder Myreth gestured to the stack of documents in the center of the table. We have 73 proposals, from 42 settlements and 11 trade guilds. They don't agree with each other. Some contradict each other directly. We're not presenting unified demands. We're presenting reality. Velmora's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Calculation, maybe. Or recognition that this negotiation wasn't following expected patterns. That's unworkable, she said. That's governance, Myreth replied. The Empire has been trying to impose workable solutions for generations. It created the instability you're trying to suppress. So what exactly are you proposing? That the Empire stops governing frontier territories like they're extensions of the capital. That taxation reflects actual services provided rather than extraction for its own sake. That consolidation wars end. That bloodlines stop getting erased for threatening inherited authority. Myreth paused. That the Empire admits it doesn't have all the answers and starts governing with input from people who actually live in places it claims to protect. That's not governance. That's abdication. That's evolution. Things that can't adapt die. Empires aren't exceptions to that rule. The negotiation stretched across 3 days, Velmora pushing for consolidation, the frontier delegation pushing for autonomy, both sides recognizing that pure victory would just restart the cycle of control and rebellion. On the second day, Vaelor spoke directly to Velmora. You want stability, he said. I understand that. I spent 15 years pursuing the same goal. And failed, Velmora replied. And learned. Stability built on suppression is just delayed rebellion. You can maintain it for decades, maybe generations. But the cost compounds. Eventually, the whole structure collapses. So what's your alternative? Accepting instability? Building systems that accommodate change rather than preventing it?
Governing through negotiation rather than decree. That's naive. It's pragmatic. You're here negotiating because eliminating us became too expensive. That's not weakness. That's recognition that power has limits. Vaelor studied him, measuring, calculating whether this was genuine transformation or strategic performance. "You're not the king I knew," she said finally. "No, I'm not. The king I knew would have executed everyone in this room to maintain authority. That king was maintaining machinery built on inherited assumptions. I'm trying to figure out if something better is possible. And if it's not, then at least I tried. That's more than I did for 15 years. Vaelor was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed, not mockingly, genuinely. "You're either the most evolved tyrant in history or the most naive revolutionary. I can't decide which." "Maybe both," Vaelor said. "Maybe that's what transformation looks like. Uncomfortable, contradictory, refusing clean categories." On the third day, they reached not agreement but framework. The Empire would cede autonomy to frontier territories in exchange for continued trade agreements and defensive alliance. Taxation would decrease. Imperial soldiers would withdraw from settlements that requested it. Consolidation wars would end with formal treaty. And bloodlines that had been suppressed would receive acknowledgement, not restoration of titles or lands. Just recognition that they'd existed, that they'd been erased, that the Empire's version of history had gaps. It wasn't revolution, wasn't transformation, wasn't the clean victory either side had imagined, but it was change, real, documented, enforceable through mechanisms both sides accepted. The treaty was signed in the trading post with witnesses from both sides. Formal language written by people who understood that words matter when violence is the alternative. Vaelor signed as Chancellor representing imperial authority. Elder Mureth signed representing frontier settlements. And at the bottom, 2 additional signatures. Vaelor Draven, former king. Current, no one in particular. Seris Virell, last known heir to House Solaryn, person who refused to be a symbol. Witnesses to transformation they'd started without meaning to. After the signing, Vaelor approached them privately. "This doesn't mean we're allies," she said. "I know," Vaelor replied. "I'll spend the rest of my career trying to consolidate what I can, trying to maintain empire even in diminished form." "I know that too. And you'll spend yours undermining that consolidation, pushing for more autonomy, more change." "Probably." Vaelor smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "At least we're honest about it. That's more than most political enemies manage." She turned to Seris. "You could have been dangerous, could have led that revolution Mylor wanted, burned the Empire instead of negotiating with it." "I could have," Seris agreed. "Chose not to. Chose being complicated instead of mythological." "Was it worth it? Giving up that power?" "I didn't give up power. I gave up letting power define me. Different calculation." Vaelor studied her, then nodded. "I think I understand. Doesn't mean I agree. But I understand." She left with her delegation. Imperial soldiers marching in formation. Ceremony maintained even in diminished circumstances. The frontier delegation dispersed over the following days, returning to settlements, carrying treaty language, carrying proof that maybe change was possible without total collapse. Seris and Vaelor remained at the trading post for 3 additional days. No particular reason, just exhaustion settling in, the kind that comes from sustained crisis finally ending. They sat on the building's porch watching sunset paint frontier landscape in colors that should have been beautiful, but just looked tired. "What now?" Seris asked. "Honestly, I have no idea." "That's not reassuring. It's honest." She almost smiled. "You keep using that word, honest, like it's some kind of achievement. For someone who spent 15 years in diplomatic language, it is." They sat in silence while daylight faded. Not uncomfortable silence, just the quiet of 2 people who'd survived something together and weren't sure what surviving meant for whatever came after. "I'm going back to the frontier," Seris said finally. "The real frontier, where I started, where people remember me as soldier before they knew me as symbol." "That's probably wise." "You could come with me." The offer hung in the air between them, not romantic, not strategic, Just practical acknowledgement that partnership forged in crisis sometimes continued beyond the crisis that created it. I could, Vaelor agreed. Or I could stay here, help implement treaty provisions, make sure the change we negotiated actually happens. That's ambitious. It's necessary. Seris looked at him. At the king who'd transformed into something else, something that didn't have title or clear definition. We're not going to see each other again, are we? She asked. Probably not often. Geography isn't kind to people moving in different directions. That's disappointing. It's honest. She did smile at that. Tired. Genuine. You really have changed. The king who rejected me would never have admitted disappointment. The king who rejected you was performing sovereignty. This is just me. And what's just you want? Vaelor was quiet for a long moment, considering, measuring words against truth in ways he'd never bothered to before. I want to figure out if transformation is possible without destruction, if empires can evolve instead of collapsing, if people like me, who enabled atrocities through ignorance, can become something better without pretending the past didn't happen. He looked at her. What is just you want? To be something other than bloodline or symbol or weapon. To find out who Seris actually is when she's not defined by survival or heritage or what other people need her to be. That's good answer. It's honest answer. They sat until stars emerged, until night settled complete, until exhaustion demanded sleep and tomorrow demanded decisions. Before they separated to their rooms, Seris touched Vaelor's arm. Brief contact. Not intimate, just acknowledgement. Thank you, she said. For what? For choosing differently, in the arena. When you could have let me die and restored your position, you chose truth over convenience. That mattered. You rejected the Empire's offer to disappear. That mattered too. Taught me that maybe survival without selfhood isn't survival at all. We're quite the pair of disasters, Seris said. Functional disasters, though. We didn't burn everything. Just most things. Progress. They separated. To different rooms, different futures, different versions of whatever came after transformation that had started with humiliation and rejection and two people refusing to accept the roles everyone else had written. Seris left the next morning. Dawn departure. No ceremony, just walking into frontier landscape that had always been more honest about brutality than palaces ever managed. Vaelor watched her go. Felt something tighten in his chest that might have been regret or might have been recognition that some partnerships are meant to be temporary. Intense. World-changing while they last, but not designed for permanence. He stayed at the trading post for 2 more days, then traveled not to the capital, but to the eastern territories where consolidation wars had hit hardest, where families he'd approved erasing through bureaucratic distance still lived in the ruins of what imperial efficiency had destroyed. He arrived without ceremony, without guards, just a man carrying guilt and hoping work might transform guilt into something useful. The first family he approached didn't recognize him, just saw someone offering labor, someone willing to help rebuild structures that imperial soldiers had destroyed. He worked for 3 weeks before anyone realized who he was. By then, he'd helped rebuild 6 homes, cleared rubble from 7 more, listened to stories about consolidation wars from people who'd survived them. When they finally recognized him, he expected violence, expected rage, expected justice served cold and sharp. Instead, they offered him a meal. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness would require reconciliation he hadn't earned, just acknowledgement that he was trying. The trying mattered even when it couldn't undo what had been done. "You're the king," said an old woman whose entire family had been erased in campaigns he'd approved. "Or you were." "I was," Vaelor agreed. "What are you now?" "Someone trying to figure out if change is possible, if people who enabled harm can become something better. And can they? I don't know, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life finding out." She studied him, measured him against something internal. "Then you can stay, work, help rebuild, but don't expect us to forget what your orders cost us." "I don't. And don't expect forgiveness just because you're performing redemption." "I'm not performing. I'm just working. Forgiveness isn't something I get to demand." She nodded. "Then we understand each other." Vaelor stayed in the Eastern Territories for 6 months, then a year, working, listening,
learning what governance looked like when you couldn't hide behind authority and carefully maintain distance. News filtered through. The empire was changing, slowly, painfully. Consolidation had ended. Frontier territories were developing independent governance structures. Trade continued. Defense alliance held, not paradise. Paradise was propaganda, but functional, honest about its failures, building systems that accommodated complexity rather than eliminating it. And Seris, he heard stories. She'd returned to frontier military, not as symbol, not as bloodline, just as soldier who was good at her job and refused promotion beyond what competence justified. She'd declined offers to lead Solaryn resurgence movements, had burned those offers publicly. Literally. With the same fire that had awakened in the arena, she was just Seris, person, soldier, woman who discovered that refusing mythology was its own kind of power. They exchanged letters occasionally, brief, honest, updates without expectation of response. He told her about rebuilding, about families teaching him what his orders had cost, about learning to carry guilt without letting guilt become excuse for paralysis. She told him about frontier service, about soldiers who remembered her from before she became visible, about finding peace in being competent rather than legendary. Neither letter said I miss you. Neither letter said I was wrong. Neither letter tried to resurrect partnership that had served its purpose and ended gracefully. They were just letters between people who'd survived something together and carried marks from that survival. 5 years passed like that. Then 10. The empire transformed slowly, the kind of gradual evolution that doesn't make it into dramatic histories but changes everything anyway. Vaelor never returned to the capital, never reclaimed authority, never tried to rebuild what he'd given up. He just worked in communities the empire had damaged, building relationships through labor rather than decree, learning that leadership sometimes meant following, that authority sometimes meant acknowledging you don't have answers. People started calling him Builder, not King, not Your Majesty, just Builder, the man who'd been emperor and chose something smaller, something honest, something that required getting his hands dirty and his pride damaged and his assumptions constantly challenged. And Seris, she became captain eventually, not through ambition, through competence acknowledged by people who didn't care about bloodlines or mythology. She led patrols, trained soldiers, kept frontier settlements safe from threats both external and internal. She never manifested Solaryn fire again, not publicly, not dramatically, just lived as person who happened to carry ancestral power she chose not to wield unless necessity demanded it. People forgot she was special, forgot she'd almost started wars, forgot she'd rejected empire and revolution simultaneously. She preferred it that way. 20 years after the arena, after the rejection, after everything that followed. Vaelor was working on a reconstruction project in the eastern borderlands when he received a message. Frontier military delegation arriving for treaty renewal discussions. Captain Seris Virell among the representatives. He cleaned up, changed into clothes that didn't carry construction dust, tried to remember what she looked like beyond the memory of someone wrapped in fire refusing to be mythology. She arrived 3 days later, older, face-carrying lines that came from decades of frontier sun and honest living, hair cut short, practical, military. She saw him and smiled. Not the tired smile from 20 years ago. Something easier, more comfortable. Builder, she said. Title, acknowledgement, maybe affection. Captain, he replied. They shook hands, professional, brief, contact that carried history without dwelling in it. You look different, she said. I'm older. Also carrying about 40 pounds more muscle from construction work. Suits you better than ceremonial armor. That's damning with faint praise, she almost laughed. How have you been? Building, learning, carrying guilt in ways that maybe help instead of just performing penance. That's honest. I learned from the best. They talked for an hour, catching up, sharing stories about the last 20 years, about lives that had diverged and found meaning in different directions, about learning that survival without growth was just extended dying. The transformation required choosing daily to be better than yesterday, that legends were prisons and being human was liberation. Before she left to continue her delegation duties, Seris looked at him seriously. Do you regret it? She asked. Giving up the throne,
spending 20 years in manual labor and obscurity. Vaelor considered the question, measured his answer against truth instead of performance. No, he said finally. Being king was being machinery. This is being human. I prefer human. Even though human is harder, especially because human is harder, easy things don't change you. They just let you stay comfortable while pretending you're growing. Seris nodded. Good answer. You taught me that too, in the arena, when you chose being yourself over being weapon. We taught each other, she said. That's how transformation works. Through collision, through people refusing to let each other hide behind comfortable narratives. She turned to leave, stopped, turned back. If you're ever in the northern frontier territories, there's this terrible bar where frontier soldiers drink after long patrols. You'd hate it. It's loud and uncomfortable, and nobody cares about your past. Sounds perfect. I'm there most months. End of patrol cycles. If you wanted company that doesn't require performing redemption. I'd like that. Good. She left. Vaelor watched her go, felt that same tightness in his chest from 20 years ago. Recognition that some people change you fundamentally, not through romance or destiny or any of the clean narratives people tell, just through collision, through refusing to let each other settle, through demanding honesty when honesty was expensive. He returned to his work, building, listening, learning. And occasionally, when patrol cycles aligned with reconstruction schedules and geography cooperated, he traveled north, to a terrible bar where frontier soldiers drank and nobody cared about legends, where he and Seris would sit in corners, trading stories, arguing about governance, laughing about the impossibility of everything they'd survived. Not romantic, not destiny, not any of the easy categories, just human, complicated, honest, which was better than legends, because legends are what you become when you die. Being human is what you do while you're still living. And living, it turned out, was the harder achievement, the one that required choosing daily to be better, to carry guilt without letting guilt become identity, to transform without pretending the past could be erased. Seris understood that. Vaelor understood that. And understanding that together occasionally, in terrible bars where nobody cared about their history, was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered. The empire continued, changed, evolved, not into paradise, but into something more honest about its failures. The frontier territories developed their own governance, their own identity, their own relationship with imperial authority that resembled partnership more than subjugation. And in spaces between empire and frontier, in communities rebuilding from old wars and old wounds, two people who'd almost destroyed everything discovered something more important than victory. They discovered that transformation is possible, that people who've enabled harm can become better, that symbols can become human again if they're willing to do the uncomfortable work of choosing honestly instead of comfortably. They discovered that the greatest rulers don't conquer merely to reign. They endure the unbearable burden of power without surrendering the soul that made them worthy to lead. And then they discover that maybe leading isn't the point. Maybe becoming human is. Years later, when Vaelor was old and construction work had become more supervision than labor, someone asked him what he'd learned from giving up the crown. He thought about the arena, about rejection becoming transformation, about a woman wrapped in fire refusing to be mythology, about 20 years learning that redemption isn't performance. I learned that sovereignty is easy, he said finally. Being human is hard, and hard things are the only ones worth doing. Do you miss it, the power? Every day. But missing it reminds me why I gave it up. Power is seductive. It makes you believe you're special. The rules don't apply to you. The cruelty can be justified through strategic necessity. He looked at the community he'd helped rebuild, at people who'd forgiven nothing but accepted his presence anyway. Being human means understanding you're not special, that rules apply to you exactly as much as everyone else, that cruelty is cruelty regardless of how you justify it. That's a hard way to live. It's the only way worth living. And far to the north, in a frontier outpost where imperial authority was still more suggestion than law, an old captain trained new soldiers and occasionally visited terrible bars, where she told stories about the time she almost became mythology and chose being human instead.
where she carried ancestral fire beneath her skin but wielded it so rarely that people forgot it existed,
where she was just Seris, competent, honest, human, which was better than being a symbol, better than being a weapon, better than being anything except exactly who she'd chosen to become. The Empire had tried to bury monsters. Instead, it buried heirs. And when those heirs refused to stay buried, they discovered something more dangerous than any power inherited through bloodlines. They discovered that being human, with all its complications and failures and uncomfortable honesty, was the greatest achievement. Not because it was easy, because it was real. And real, it turned out, was what lasted after legends faded and empires transformed and symbols became people again. Real was what mattered when everything else burned away. Real was choosing daily to be better. And that choice, repeated across decades, across communities, across two people who'd survived the impossible and decided to keep surviving honestly, was how empires didn't collapse. They evolved, slowly, painfully, honestly, into something that acknowledged its brutality instead of hiding behind civilization's costume. Into something that could look at itself clearly and say, we were monsters dressed as glory and we're trying to become something better. That transformation never finished, never reached completion, never became the paradise propaganda promised. But it was real. And real, scarred, honest transformation was worth more than any legend, worth more than any crown, worth more than any power that required surrendering your humanity to wield. Seris and Vaelor understood that. Not at the beginning, not even in the middle, but eventually, through collision and choice and the uncomfortable work of becoming. And that understanding, hard-won and honestly carried, was their legacy. Not kingdoms ruled, not wars won, not symbols that inspired generations, just two people who refused to let power define them, who chose being complicated over being legendary, who discovered that the unbearable burden of transformation was lighter than the crushing weight of performing invincibility. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.